The noble lover of beauty engages in love wherever he sees excellence and splendid natural endowment without regard for any difference in physiological detail. The words of celebrated biographer and historian Plutarch echo the contemporary ravings of liberal activists, yet they were written almost 2,000 years ago. If this indifference to physiology, this definition of love based on soul alone, was respected in a culture that had yet to discover electricity, how were they able to accept what we as a first world nation have only begun to recently consider? The ancient Greeks are infamous for their indifference to physiological dichotomies when it came to romance. They had no concept of sexuality, only aphrodisia, just love. From vases to parchment, from Plato's philosophy to Sappho's poetry, recordings of Greek homosexuality and gender fluidity are anything but scarce. Much of what is articled and discussed about homosexuality amongst the scholastic community covers merely the pederasty of Greek men. It was indeed acceptable for an older lover, the Ereses, to court a boy, the Eromenos. There was gift-giving and courtship involved, analogous to that of marriage between a man and a woman. The misconception that occurs surrounds the belief that these relationships were merely for as long as the Eromenos remained a boy, or that they were merely for pedagogical purposes. Quite the contrary, numerous artistic depictions of homosexual relationships present little to no age differences in the men. Beauty, as opposed to youth, was most important. Furthermore, the mythology of the day possessed no lack of LGBT representation. The blind prophet Tiresias was frequently mentioned as a figure who had lived many years of his life in each different gender, and was blessed with acute wisdom for it. But the Greeks were far from the only ancient civilization to record a normalcy surrounding what is now considered the LGBT community. In the pre-Islamic and early Islamic Arabian society, a specific form of publicly recognized and institutionalized effeminacy existed in the form of mukanan. Unlike other men, the mukanan were permitted to associate freely with women, as they were assumed to have no sexual interest towards them. They played a vital role in the development of Arabic music, and were considered some of the most celebrated singers and instrumentalists in Medina and Mecca, two of the three holy cities of Islam. And in ancient Egypt, evidence of recognized and even honored homosexuality exists to this day. When archaeologists uncovered the tomb of Nayan Khnum and Khnum-Hotep in 1964, they revealed a scene that would perpetually alter the historic view of Egyptian social customs and sexuality. Carved in stone were images of two men embracing, highly esteemed chief manicurists of the king. In the scenes, the men are shown holding hands and nose-kissing, the favorite form of kissing in Egypt at the time. Not only that, but the semi-public nature of their tomb may suggest their relationship was accepted as normal by the elite. In primitive cultures worldwide, alternatives to heterosexual and cisgender identities were at times considered wiser or more masculine if the relationship was between two males. Where did the perception of sexuality and the reception of gender change? When did it become immoral or weak to identify under the wide spectrum of genders and sexualities other than heterosexual and cisgendered? The answer is par for the course. The advent of class divisions, the acquisition of wealth and power, and the ownership of property fed a movement toward patriarchal government, which ultimately became threatened by female, transgender, and homosexual male spiritual leaders. When these societies were able to entrench the notion that females should be subservient, gender-variant persons possessed an interesting quandary for the Roman Catholic Church. The solution? Stamp out such identities, as opposed to addressing them as a crucial part of history that existed without the reign of the Church. As the status of women was degraded, leadership also typically portrayed any variants as less than male. Dual-spirited gods and goddesses, thought at one time to be more powerful, became weak entities. When battles occurred across factions, homosexual and transgender tendencies or relationships were used to justify the destruction of enemies. When Constantine arrived in 342 AD, his synthesis of early Christianity with ancient Roman religions, as well as the fusion of church and state, strengthened anti-LGBT sentiment and set the stage for the Crusades and the Inquisition, in which nearly all evidence of matriarchal or transgender-venerating paganism was eradicated from history. Repressive laws aimed to crush same-sex love and gender variance evolved into part of the Corpus Juris Civilis, the Roman body of law upon which many legal systems were later based. Fast forward to the 18th century, and LGBT identities are thriving under the radar or guise of socially acceptable means. In 1755, the first openly gay and transgender person, Charlotte Clark, comes out through the publishing of A Narrative of the Life of Miss Charlotte Clark, the continuing discovery of LGBT individuals did not cease. In the medical community, following the discovery of eminent figures such as Dr. James Barry, a surgeon with the British Army who was discovered at death to have possessed female sex characteristics and had been male passing for most of his life, takes a stand in the form of Magnus Hirschfeld. He founds the Institute for Sexuality in Berlin, the first clinic to serve transgender persons regularly, and developed their study in 1919. In the 1920s, the LGBT community began its evolution from secrecy to openness. Violet Morris, an openly lesbian and masculine-presenting French athlete, sued the French Federation of Feminine Sports for withdrawing her license to wear trousers in a public controversy. Drag balls developed in Harlem, originally arranged by gay white men, but very quickly became multiracial. The balls developed into a transformative dance culture movement, perhaps foreshadowed by ancient Arabic music and dance culture. However, the rise of the Nazi Party drove much of this work underground until the final third of the century. One of the first priorities of Hitler's regime was to attack Hirschfeld's work for the Institute, as it was considered a conjunction between what was considered sexual perversion and Jewish sciences. In 1933, a short few months after Hitler assumed power in Germany, the Institute of Sexology was vandalized and looted by a mob of Nazi students. The archives of books, photographs, and research documents were burned publicly in Opera Square. Physicians and researchers involved with the clinic fled Germany or commit suicide. Nazi Germany's abasement and execution of members of the LGBT movement inspired action. Harry Benjamin, starting in San Francisco and New York, began using hormones to help transgender persons transition, a revolutionary and unheard-of treatment.
My name is Max, I'm 16 years old, and I'm 4 days on testosterone. History has evolved so much, and it's crazy to think that a century ago, I would not have been able to transition. I might have been killed a century ago. An important part of a transgender person's transition is support and love. So I'm forever grateful for that.
Following the Stonewall riots, a series of violent protests from the gay community against unlawful raids of gay bars by New York City police, the LGBT community began to receive medical, political, and legal recognition of their history with oppression. In 1973, homosexuality was delisted from the medical community's standard DSM, declaring that it was no longer a mental disorder and, more importantly, never was. In 1977, Harvey Milk won a seat on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors and introduced a gay rights ordinance protecting gays and lesbians from being fired from their jobs. But the battle for rights is still ever present to this day.
I think Orlando, Florida is a little safer tonight. Now that 50, the tragedy is that more of them didn't die. The tragedy is I'm kind of upset that he didn't finish the job.
The deadliest mass shooting American history has ever witnessed occurred no more than a year ago at the Orlando gay nightclub Pulse. The AIDS epidemic, despite being a continuing period of over 30 years of illness, fear, and death, still remains the butt of jokes and harmful social and medical stigma. And conversion therapy is legal in 45 states, regardless of attempted suicide rates being 8 times as high for LGBT youth who participate. Luckily, LGBT persons and those who love them are no longer silent. They have reasoned, passionate voices claiming their lives and their loves. George Takei, better known as Sulu from Star Trek, said it himself beautifully. We should indeed keep calm in the face of difference and live our lives in a state of inclusion and wonder at the diversity of humanity.